Welcome to the Federalist Paper 39 class by the Grumpy Old Vet. This is Lesson 15 in this series. This lesson will cover Essay 39 of 85 essays, all written to the people of the state of New York, in counter to the arguments of the Anti-Federalists to convince the people of the 13 states to ratify the Constitution. This essay was written by Madison to explain how some parts of the government are federal and other parts are national, but that it conforms to a republican form of government. Madison also discusses the spheres of control and the sovereignty of the states. With that, let's move out. Welcome to the class, Federalist Paper 39, brought to you by the Hillsdale Justice Project at Liberty Hall. Narrated by John Rutan. The conformity of the plan to Republican principles. The Federalist Number 39, 16th of January 1788, written by Madison for the Independent Journal. And as all 85 Federalist papers start out, to the people of the state of New York, the last paper having concluded the observations which were meant to introduce a candid survey of the plan of government reported by the convention, we now proceed to the execution of that part of our undertaking. The first question that offers itself is whether the general form and aspect of the government be strictly republican. It is evident that no other form would be reconcilable with the genius of the people of America, with the fundamental principles of the Revolution, or with that honorable determination which animates every votary of freedom to rest all our political experiments on the capacity of mankind for self-government. If the plan of the convention therefore be found to depart from the republican character, its advocates must abandon it as no longer defensible. The previous paper finished discussing the introduction to the government plan put forward by the convention. Now, we will begin evaluating the actual plan. The first question we need to address is whether the general structure of the government is truly republican. It's clear that no other form of government would align with the American people's values, the core principles of the Revolution, or the belief in freedom that inspires everyone who supports self-government. Therefore, if the convention's plan is found to deviate from a republican form of government, its supporters will have to abandon it because it would no longer be justifiable. What then are the distinctive characters of the republican form? Were an answer to this question to be sought, not by recurring to principles, but in the application of the term by political writers to the constitutions of different states, no satisfactory one would ever be found. Holland, in which no particle of the supreme authority is derived from the people, has passed almost universally under the denomination of a republic. The same title has been bestowed on Venice, where absolute power over the great body of the people is exercised in the most absolute manner by a small body of hereditary nobles. Poland, which is a mixture of aristocracy and of monarchy in their worst forms, has been dignified with the same appellation. The government of England, which has one republican branch only, combined with a hereditary aristocracy and monarchy, has with equal impropriety been frequently placed on the list of republics. These examples, which are nearly as dissimilar to each other as to a genuine republic, show the extreme inaccuracy with which the term has been used in political disquisitions. What, then, are the key features of a republican government? If we try to answer this question by looking at how political writers have used the term republic to describe the constitutions of various states, we won't find a clear answer. For example, Holland, where the people don't hold any real power, has often been called a republic. Venice, where a small group of hereditary nobles hold absolute control over the people, has also been called a republic. Poland, with its mix of aristocracy and monarchy in their worst forms, has been given the same label. Even England, which has only one republican branch alongside a hereditary aristocracy and monarchy, has sometimes been called a republic. These examples, which are very different from each other and from a true republic, show how inaccurately the term republic has been used in political discussions. If we resort for a criterion to the different principles on which different forms of government are established, we may define a republic to be, or at least may bestow that name on, a government which derives all its powers directly or indirectly from the great body of the people, and is administered by persons holding their offices during pleasure, for a limited period, or during good behavior. It is essential to such a government that it be derived from the great body of the society, not from an inconsiderable proportion or a favored class of it. Otherwise, a handful of tyrannical nobles, exercising their oppressions by a delegation of their powers, might aspire to the rank of republicans and claim for their government the honorable title of republic. It is sufficient for such a government that the persons administering it be appointed, either directly or indirectly, by the people, and that they hold their appointments by either of the tenures just specified. Otherwise, every government in the United States, as well as every other popular government that has been or can be well organized or well executed, would be degraded from the republican character. According to the Constitution of every state in the Union, some or other of the officers of government are appointed indirectly only by the people. According to most of them, the chief magistrate himself is so appointed. And according to one, this mode of appointment is extended to one of the coordinate branches of the legislature. According to all the constitutions also, the tenure of the highest offices is extended to a definite period, and in many instances, both within the legislative and executive departments, to a period of years. According to the provisions of most of the constitutions, again, as well as according to the most respectable and received opinions on the subject, the members of the Judiciary Department are to retain their offices by the firm tenure of good behavior. Civil. If we look at the different principles that form the basis of various types of government, we can define a republic as a government that gets its powers, either directly or indirectly, from the people as a whole. The government is run by individuals who hold their positions either temporarily, for a limited time, or as long as they act properly. For a government to be truly republican, its authority must come from the majority of the population, not just from a small or privileged group. Otherwise, a small group of powerful nobles could abuse their power and falsely claim to run a republic. In a republican government, it's enough that those in power are appointed, either directly or indirectly, by the people, and that they hold office for a specified time or as long as they behave well. If we didn't follow this principle, then even the government of the United States and any other well-organized civil government could lose its republican character. In every state in the Union, some government officials are appointed indirectly by the people. In most states, the highest official, the chief magistrate, is appointed this way. In one state, this method of appointment even applies to one of the branches of the legislature. Additionally, all state constitutions require that the highest government positions are held for a fixed time period, and in many cases, the positions are held for a number of years. For the judiciary, most state constitutions, as well as the general understanding on the matter, state that judges hold their positions based on good behavior, not for on comparing the Constitution planned by the Convention with the standard here fixed, we perceive at once that it is in the most rigid sense conformable to it. The House of Representatives, like that of one branch at least of all the state legislatures, is elected immediately by the great body of the people. The Senate, like the present Congress and the Senate of Maryland, derives its appointment indirectly from the people. The President is indirectly derived from the choice of the people, according to the example in most of the states. Even the judges, with all other officers of the Union, will, as in the several states, be the choice, though a remote choice, of the people themselves. The duration of the appointments is equally conformable to the Republican standard and to the model of the state constitutions. The House of Representatives is periodically elective, as in all the states, and for the period of 2 years, as in the state of South Carolina. The Senate is elective for the period of 6 years, which is but 1 year more than the period of the Senate of Maryland, and but 2 more than that of the Senates of New York and Virginia. The President is to continue in office for the period of 4 years. As in New York and Delaware, the Chief Magistrate is elected for 3 years, and in South Carolina for 2 years. In the other states, the election is annual. In several of the states, however, no explicit provision is made for the impeachment of the Chief Magistrate. and in Delaware and Virginia, he is not impeachable till out of office. The President of the United States is impeachable at any time during his continuance in office. The tenure by which the judges are to hold their places is, as it unquestionably ought to be, that of good behavior. The tenure of the ministerial offices generally will be a subject of legal regulation, conformably to the reason of the case and the example of the state constitutions. When we compare the Constitution proposed by the Convention with the standards we've set, it's clear that it follows them very closely. The House of Representatives is directly elected by the people, just like one branch of most state legislatures. The Senate, like the current Congress and the Maryland Senate, is indirectly elected by the people. The President is indirectly chosen by the people, as is the case in most states. Even the judges, like other federal officials, are chosen by the people, though indirectly. The length of time for which officials serve also fits the Republican standard and mirrors state constitutions. The House of Representatives is elected every 2 years, just like in South Carolina. The Senate is elected for 6 years, which is only 1 year longer than Maryland's Senate and 2 years longer than New York and Virginia's. The President serves for 4 years, similar to the chief magistrates in New York and Delaware, who are elected for 3 years, and South Carolina, where the term is 2 years. In some states, elections are held annually. However, some states don't have specific provisions for impeaching the chief magistrate. In Delaware and Virginia, a governor can only be impeached after leaving office. The President of the United States, however, can be impeached at any time during their term. Judges will hold their positions based on good behavior, which is as it should be. The terms for other government officials will be regulated by law, following the reasoning and examples set by the state constitutions. Could any further proof be required of the Republican complexion of this system, the most decisive one might be found in its absolute prohibition of titles of nobility, both under the federal and the state governments, and in its express guarantee of the Republican form to each of the latter. If any further proof is needed that this system is Republican in nature, the most clear evidence can be found in its complete ban on titles of nobility, both at the federal and state levels, as well as in its guarantee that each state will have a Republican form of government. But it was not sufficient, say the adversaries of the proposed Constitution, for the Convention to adhere to the Republican form. They ought with equal care to have preserved the federal form, which regards the Union as a confederacy of sovereign states, instead of which they have framed a national government, which regards the Union as a consolidation of the states. And it is asked by what authority this bold and radical innovation was undertaken. The handle which has been made of this objection requires that it should be examined with some precision. Opponents of the proposed Constitution argue that it wasn't enough for the Convention to stick to the Republican form. They also should have preserved the federal form, which treats the Union as a confederacy of independent states. Instead, they created a national government that treats the Union as a single, consolidated entity. The critics ask by what authority this major and sweeping change was made. This objection needs to be carefully examined. Without inquiring into the accuracy of the distinction on which the objection is founded, it will be necessary to a just estimate of its force, first to ascertain the real character of the government in question, secondly, to inquire how far the Convention were authorized to propose such a government, and thirdly, how far the duty they owed to their country could supply any defect of regular authority. First, in order to ascertain the real character of the government, it may be considered in relation to the foundation on which it is to be established, to the sources from which its ordinary powers are to be drawn, to the operation of those powers, to the extent of them, and to the authority by which future changes in the government are to be introduced. First, to understand the true nature of the government, we need to look at several factors: the foundation it will be built on, the sources of its powers, how those powers will work, how far they will reach, and the authority that will allow for future changes to the government. On examining the first relation, it appears on one hand that the Constitution is to be founded on the assent and ratification of the people of America, given by deputies elected for the special purpose, but on the other, that this assent and ratification is to be given by the people, not as individuals composing one entire nation, but as composing the distinct and independent states to which they respectively belong. It is to be the assent and ratification of the several states derived from the supreme authority in each state, the authority of the people themselves. The act, therefore, establishing the Constitution will not be a national, but a federal act. When we look at the first aspect, we see that the Constitution is based on the approval and ratification of the people of America, who will be represented by deputies elected for that specific purpose. However, this approval is not given by the people as one united nation, but as members of the separate and independent states to which they belong. Therefore, the approval and ratification will come from the people in each state, acting under the highest authority in each state, the people themselves. As a result, the act that creates the Constitution will be a federal act, not a national one. That it will be a federal and not a national act, as these terms are understood by the objectors, the act of the people as forming so many independent states, not as forming one aggregate nation, is obvious from this single consideration, that it is to result neither from the decision of a majority of the people of the Union, nor from that of a majority of the states. It must result from the unanimous assent of the several states that are parties to it, differing no otherwise from their ordinary assent than in its being expressed, not by the legislative authority, but by that of the people themselves. Were the people regarded in this transaction as forming one nation, the will of the majority of the whole people of the United States would bind the minority, in the same manner as the majority in each state must bind the minority, and the will of the majority must be determined either by a comparison of the individual votes, or by considering the will of the majority of the states as evidence of the will of a majority of the people of the United States. Neither of these rules has been adopted. Each state, in ratifying the Constitution, is considered as a sovereign body independent of all others, and only to be bound by its own voluntary act. In this relation, then, the new Constitution will, if established, be a federal and not a national Constitution. The Constitution will be a federal act, not a national one, as the objectors use these terms. This is clear from the fact that the Constitution won't be based on the decision of a majority of the people in the entire Union or a majority of the states. Instead, it will be based on the unanimous agreement of the states that are involved. The only difference from their usual approval process is that it will be expressed by the people themselves, not by the state legislatures. If the people were acting as one nation, the majority of the entire United States would bind the minority, just as the majority in each state binds the minority. But that's not how the process works. Each state, when ratifying the Constitution, is seen as an independent entity bound only by its own voluntary choice. So, if the Constitution is adopted, it will be a federal constitution, not a national one. The next relation is to the sources from which the ordinary powers of government are to be derived. The House of Representatives will derive its powers from the people of America, and the people will be represented in the same proportion and on the same principle as they are in the legislature of a particular state. So far, the government is national, not federal. The Senate, on the other hand, will derive its powers from the states as political and co-equal societies, and these will be represented on the principle of equality in the Senate, as they now are in the existing Congress. So far, the government is federal, not national. The executive power will be derived from a very compound source. The immediate election of the president is to be made by the states in their political characters. The votes allotted to them are in a compound ratio, which considers them partly as distinct and co-equal societies, partly as unequal members of the same society. The eventual election, again, is to be made by that branch of the legislature which consists of the national representatives. But in this particular act, they are to be thrown into the form of individual delegations from so many distinct and co-equal bodies politic. From this aspect of the government, it appears to be of a mixed character, presenting at least as many federal as national features. The next thing to consider is where the ordinary powers of government will come from. The House of Representatives will get its power from the people of America, and the people will be represented in the same way and proportion as they are in the legislature of their own state. In this respect, the government is national, not federal. However, the Senate will get its power from the states as independent, equal entities. The states will be represented equally in the Senate, just like they are in the current Congress. In this regard, the government is federal, not national. The executive power will come from a mix of sources. The president will be directly elected by the states in their political roles. The votes each state gets will be based partly on their status as independent, equal entities, and partly on their size in the Union. The final election of the president will be made by the part of the legislature that represents the national people, but the process will still reflect the states as separate, equal bodies. From this, we can see that the government has both federal and national elements. The difference between a federal and national government, as it relates to the operation of the government, is, by the adversaries of the plan of the convention, supposed to consist in this, that in the former, the powers operate on the political bodies composing the Confederacy in their political capacities, in the latter, on the individual citizens composing the nation in their individual capacities. On trying the Constitution by this criterion, it falls under the national, not the federal character, though perhaps not so completely as has been understood. In several cases, and particularly in the trial of controversies to which states may be parties, they must be viewed and proceeded against in their collective and political capacities only. But the operation of the government on the people in their individual capacities, in its ordinary and most essential proceedings, will on the whole, in the sense of its opponents, designate it in this relation, a national government. The difference between a federal and national government, according to critics of the convention's plan, is that in a federal system, the powers apply to the states or political bodies as groups, while in a national system, the powers apply to individual citizens. If we judge the Constitution by this standard, it leans more toward a national government than a federal one, though not entirely as some might think. In some cases, especially when states are involved in disputes, they will still be treated as collective, political entities. But in most situations, where the government is dealing with individuals, it will function more like a national government, as its critics would define it. But if the government be national with regard to the operation of its powers, it changes its aspect again when we contemplate it in relation to the extent of its powers. The idea of a national government involves in it not only an authority over the individual citizens, but an indefinite supremacy over all persons and things, so far as they are objects of lawful government. Among a people consolidated into one nation, this supremacy is completely vested in the national legislature. Among communities united for particular purposes, it is vested partly in the general and partly in the municipal legislatures. In the former case, all local authorities are subordinate to the supreme and may be controlled, directed, or abolished by it at pleasure. In the latter, the local or municipal authorities form distinct and independent portions of the supremacy, no more subject within their respective spheres to the general authority than the general authority is subject to them within its own sphere. In this relation, then, the proposed government cannot be deemed a national one, since its jurisdiction extends to certain enumerated objects only, and leaves to the several states a residuary and inviolable sovereignty over all other objects. It is true that in controversies relating to the boundary between the two jurisdictions, the tribunal which is ultimately to decide is to be established under the general government. But this does not change the principle of the case. The decision is to be impartially made according to the rules of the Constitution, and all the usual and most effectual precautions are taken to secure this impartiality. Some such tribunal is clearly essential to prevent an appeal to the sword and a dissolution of the compact, and that it ought to be established under the general, rather than under the local governments, or to speak more properly, that it could be safely established under the first alone, is a position not likely to be combated. While the government may seem national in how it exercises its powers, its nature changes when we look at the scope of those powers. A national government would have not just authority over individual citizens, but broad control over all matters within its jurisdiction. In a fully unified nation, this ultimate authority would lie with the national legislature. However, when communities are united for specific purposes, authority is shared between the national government and local governments. In a truly national system, local authorities are subordinate to the national government, which can control, direct, or eliminate them at will. In a federal system, local authorities are independent in their areas, and neither level of government has supremacy over the other in its own jurisdiction. The proposed government, however, cannot be considered national in this way. Its powers are limited to specific listed areas, leaving the states with significant, protected authority over everything else. While disputes between the national and state governments may be decided by a tribunal under the national government, this does not change the principle. The decision will be fair and based on constitutional rules, with safeguards to ensure impartiality. Such a tribunal is necessary to avoid conflict and ensure the integrity of the agreement, and it is better placed under the national government rather than local ones, which is unlikely to be disputed. If we try the Constitution by its last relation to the authority by which amendments are to be made, we find it neither wholly national nor wholly federal. Were it wholly national, the supreme and ultimate authority would reside in the majority of the people of the Union, and this authority would be competent at all times, like that of a majority of every national society, to alter or abolish its established government. Were it wholly federal, on the other hand, the concurrence of each state in the Union would be essential to every alteration that would be binding on all. The mode provided by the plan of the convention is not founded on either of these principles. In requiring more than a majority, and particularly in computing the proportion by states, not by citizens, it departs from the national and advances towards the federal character. In rendering the concurrence of less than the whole number of states sufficient, it loses again the federal and partakes of the national character. If we look at the Constitution in terms of how amendments can be made, we see that it's not entirely national or entirely federal. In a fully national system, the ultimate authority would rest with the majority of the people in the Union, and that majority could change or abolish the government whenever they chose. On the other hand, in a fully federal system, every state would need to agree to any change that would affect all of them. The way the convention's plan sets up amendments isn't based on either of these models. By requiring more than just a simple majority, and by counting states rather than individual citizens, it moves away from a national model and leans more toward a federal one. But since it allows for fewer than all the states to agree on changes, it shifts back towards a national approach, blending both ideas. The proposed Constitution, therefore, even when tested by the rules laid down by its antagonists, is in strictness neither a national nor a federal constitution, but a composition of both. In its foundation, it is federal, not national. In the sources from which the ordinary powers of the government are drawn, it is partly federal and partly national. In the operation of these powers, it is national, not federal. In the extent of them again, it is federal, not national. And finally, in the authoritative mode of introducing amendments, it is neither wholly federal nor wholly national. Publius. The proposed Constitution, when examined by the standards set by its critics, is neither fully national nor fully federal, but a mix of both. It is federal in its foundation, not national. In terms of where the government gets its powers, it's both federal and national. When it comes to how these powers are used, it leans more national than federal. In terms of the extent of its powers, it is federal. And finally, in how amendments are made, it's neither fully federal nor fully national. Publius. Summary. Federalist Paper 39, written by James Madison, discusses the nature of the proposed Constitution and its classification as either a federal or national government. The key principles of this paper are: 1. Federal versus national government. Madison examines whether the proposed Constitution is a federal or national government. He concludes that it is a combination of both. The Constitution has federal aspects, where states retain sovereignty and play a role in government functions, and national aspects, where the government has authority to go directly to the individuals in certain areas. 2. Foundation of government. The Constitution's foundation is federal because it derives its authority from the people of each state, acting through their state governments as equal and independent entities, bound only by their own voluntary choice. However, the Constitution also involves national elements, particularly in the way powers are exercised and laws are written. 3. Sources of power. The government derives its powers both from the people and the states. The House of Representatives is elected directly by the people, while the Senate represents the states. This mixed approach gives the government a blend of federal and national characteristics. 4. Operation of powers and spheres of venue. While some aspects of the Constitution operate on a national level, such as national defense, treaties, and the militia, federal authority remains limited to its enumerated powers, preserving state sovereignty in all other areas. Madison further clarifies in Federalist 45 that not only are federal powers restricted in scope, but they are also limited in venue. Federal authority applies primarily to federal lands, such as military installations, government buildings, and territories directly owned by the United States. In contrast, state governments retain full authority within their own territorial boundaries, except in matters where the Constitution explicitly grants power to the federal government. This ensures that each level of government operates within its own jurisdiction, preventing federal encroachment on state sovereignty. 5. Amendments process. The process for amending the Constitution is also a mix of federal and national elements. While it requires a supermajority and state participation, it does not require unanimous approval from all states, thus reflecting a balance between national and federal principles. Madison concludes that the Constitution creates a system that combines both national and federal elements, allowing for a stronger federal government while preserving state sovereignty. The federal government is only supreme if operating pursuant to the federal Constitution and within its own sphere of control, the same as the state government is only supreme if operating pursuant to the federal Constitution and within its own sphere of control. This concludes the 15th class in this series on Federalist Paper 39. I hope you found this information helpful and entertaining. I will see you in Class 16, where we will cover Federalist Paper 41. Fall out.